Great, let's get started. Hi, everybody, welcome. I'm so happy to see you all here for what's going to be a wonderful, wonderful program. I'm Dinda Elliott. I'm the Executive Director at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies. And just a few quick housekeeping things. Firstly, there's no recording today. And also, please, no photographs. We will be recording this event, and it will go up on our YouTube page later, but please, no recording while the talk is underway. A few other things about upcoming programs. On Friday, I'm excited to say that at 11:30, as part of our PRC at 75 series, we have a screening of Bumming in Beijing, which is about the art scene in the 1980s with an introduction by our own Professor Edward Wong, who was there back in those days, and a Q&A with the iconic director, documentary director Wu Wenguang. Afterwards. So that's going to be very, very interesting. It'll be at 11:30 from about 11:30 to 1 on Friday. Next week, on Wednesday afternoon, we have our own visiting fellow of practice, Mitch Presnick, who's here today. He's going to give a talk about a new paradigm for business engagement in China. So please tune into that. It's going to be on Zoom, so in person and in Zoom. So if you haven't signed up already, you can still join on Zoom. And on Thursday next week, we have Rowena He, who is a senior research fellow at UT Austin and was a professor here at Harvard, who's, and this is also part of our PRC at 75 series, she's going to be talking about memory as resistance. So those are all going to be very, very interesting programs. I hope you'll tune in and come. So today, we are so delighted to have with us Edward Wong, who's one of the very best journalists in the United States. And he has written a remarkable history called The Edge of Empire. The book is about modern China, but he tells the story of China through the prism of his own family's experiences across the country, from his father's experience opening the frontier in Xinjiang to his own 10 years of reporting in that country. Edward has an incredible career. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Virginia in English literature, and then he got a degree in journalism and international relations at UC Berkeley. He started his journalistic career at the Potomac Gazette, then in 1999 joined the New York Times, where he worked on the Metro desk, the sports desk, the business desk, and the foreign desk for about 4 years. But from November 2003 to 2007, he covered the Iraq War, a job that obviously required incredible stamina, courage, and sharp reporting. And he won a Livingston Award for Excellence in International Reporting for his coverage of that war. In 2008, Edward moved to China, arriving just on the eve of the 2008 Olympics at a time of great optimism and economic growth and expansion. He worked as the New York Times Beijing bureau chief until 2016. So he's been watching China closely from that time all the way through to today's era of Xi Jinping. Edward is now diplomatic correspondent for the New York Times, covering U.S. policy and the shifting global paradigm. And he also has been a Nieman Fellow at Harvard University. So welcome back. And if journalists are said to write the first draft of history, we're equally delighted to have with us as discussant today one of our very best China historians, Professor Mark Elliott, whose work delves into some of the questions that Ed's book talks about: empire, nationalism, and identity. Professor Elliott is the Vice Provost of International Affairs, and he travels the world looking over all of Harvard's international activities, but we think of him as one of our own. Professor Elliott was the director of the Fairbanks Center from 2013 to 2015, and students of China flocked to his lectures to get his perspective on New Qing history, Xinjiang Shi, and they tell me how lucky they feel to have him as their advisor. It's true, they really do. His first book, The Manchu Way, The 8 Banners and Ethnic Identity in Late Imperial China, based primarily on Manchu language sources, is a groundbreaking and influential study on the New Qing history, which is an approach that emphasizes the importance of Manchu political and military institutions in shaping the last empire. Professor Elliott is also the author of Emperor Qianlong, Son of Heaven, Man of the World, and the co-editor of New Qing Imperial History, Making Inner Asia Empire at Chengde. He earned his BA and MA at Yale, and his PhD, we'll forgive him for that, and his PhD at the University of California at Berkeley. And before joining the Harvard faculty, he was a member of the history departments at the University of California at Santa Barbara and the University of Michigan. So in addition to his primary interest in the history of relations between China and Inner Asia, Professor Elliott's research explores broader questions of empire, ethnicity, and the frontier. So I know, based on Edward's on-the-ground perspective and Professor Elliott's historical perspective, we're going to have a fascinating conversation today. So over to you, Edward. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dinda, for that wonderful introduction. And Dinda herself is a veteran journalist based in Asia for a long time, so I take my inspiration from her and her cohort. And I want to thank the Fairbanks Center. When I was here at Harvard as a fellow from 2017 to 2018, I spent many hours with professors in their classes, professors associated with the center. I attended talks here. I was on one or two panels here talking about China. And I was just telling Mark that I really wanted to take one of his classes on Qing history because it would have, I knew I was embarking this book project. The seeds of it were planted here at Harvard, and I went to take his course, but he was on leave in that fall semester, so I was unable to, and the book would be a much stronger book if I had been able to take that course. But since he's now here as a discussant, I can now, we can talk with him about some of these themes.
How about the next book?
Right, yeah, a sequel. So what I'm going to do is, this won't take the form of an academic lecture. It'll be much more personal. My research was very personal, and so I want to take you on a personal journey into how I started on this line of reporting and personal research, and it'll have a form of almost a family photo album, which many of the photos are in the book itself, and then we can talk about some of the broader themes with Mark when I'm done with this. So I'll start off. That's the title of my book, and the word empire, I think from the very early stages of work in the book, I knew I wanted to have the word empire in the title. I'd written an assessment piece of China, sort of like a farewell essay, in 2017 to 18 when I was at Harvard, actually. And in it, I called China the Empire Reborn. And so that idea had already coalesced in my head, and I knew I wanted to unpack it further in a book-length manuscript. So I grew up in the suburb of Washington, in Alexandria. This is my family and I at Mount Vernon, very American photo. I was born in D.C. My father had moved to the U.S. in '67, and then he got married to my mother in Hong Kong in '71, and they moved together to D.C. In '71 to settle there. And when I was growing up, this was how I knew my father, how I envisioned him. He worked in a Chinese restaurant in the outskirts of D.C. In Franconia, and he had on this red uniform, and it was the only uniform that associated with him during my entire childhood. And then when I was a grad student at UC Berkeley doing a master's in journalism and a master's in international area studies, I was taking courses in Chinese history, for example, with the late Fred Wakeman, a great historian. Mark, you might have taken courses with Fred when you were there. Oh, amazing. And so I became very entranced with Chinese history. I started asking my parents about their background in China. And then during one of my breaks at home in my 20s, my father showed me this photo, which he had kept in his private files and never shown us when we were growing up. And it's a photo of him in a winter PLA uniform taken in 1953 in the city of Yining, which is out in the northwest part of China in an region called Xinjiang, which I think many of you know. Back then it was on the border of Soviet Kazakhstan, or near the border, and today it's near the border with Kazakhstan. And so my father proceeded to give me the rough contours of his service in the PLA and how he had ended up in Xinjiang for around a half dozen years before he made his way back to Hong Kong out of the PRC. This is all from the beginning of the 1950s up until the late 50s. He was born in Hong Kong, grew up there, was part of a merchant family that sold herbal medicine, importing herbs from China and then selling them to Chinese enterprises throughout Southeast Asia. So he was part of this transnational class of Cantonese merchants who could move very easily between southern China, Guangdong province, Taishan County, where he's from and where many Chinese Americans trace their roots. They could move easily between Guangdong, Hong Kong, and Southeast Asia. He was born in Hong Kong, grew up there, went to elementary school there. But his father also had a shop in Guangzhou, for example. And so already in my, as my father was telling me this origin story, I already had this conception of the Cantonese as a very distinct people from other parts of China. And so I think part of my approach to China was always to view it as this conglomeration of different, very different ethnic groups with different languages. I do think Cantonese is a different language than Mandarin, even though they share mostly a written script. And that, as we know, ethnicity is defined very arbitrarily by whatever government is in power at the time. And so there was even a debate, there have been debates in modern Chinese history about whether the Cantonese should be a separate ethnic, categorized as one of the separate ethnic groups apart from the Han. And so my view has, having, known something about my family history, having read up on Guangdong, is that it itself is a very distinct part of China, or the Chinese Empire. And so it can be viewed as one of the in some ways, as one of the frontier regions of China, and as one of the regions where the Qing Empire, the last empire, came into the most frequent contact with European powers and some outside powers. And of course, we know the history of the Opium Wars, the ceding of Hong Kong to the British. And so this frontier region was a defining region in the late Qing Empire and then going into Republican China. My father moved to Guangzhou he moved to Guangdong province. He fled to Guangdong province with his older brother Sam, 4 years older, when the Japanese invaded Hong Kong in 1941. They invaded Hong Kong shortly after their attack on Pearl Harbor, and then they occupied Hong Kong. And his family felt that he should seek refuge in Taishan County, where they had their family home, because Guangdong province at that time was still a contested area between the nationalists and the Japanese. Neither military had full control of the region, and so while the Japanese were able to maintain control of Hong Kong, as well as other British colonies in Southeast Asia, they did not have full control of Guangdong, so they sought refuge there. My father grew up in Taishan County, Taishan City, and then went to high school at a prestigious boarding school in Guangzhou. Here he is with cousins and friends from that school. They would often go swimming on weekends. At that time, the Japanese have surrendered, but the Chinese Civil War is going on. And by 1949, as we know, Mao declares victory, establishes the PRC, and then shortly afterwards, they bring Guangdong under their control. And my father graduates into the first class under full communist rule, the class of 1950, from this high school, Guangya. And so at that time, he then has to make a choice, and he's heavily influenced by what he has heard the communists saying throughout his high school years, that they'll bring order back to China, that they're the power that can unify China after the disunity of the nationalists, and after the corruption of the nationalists and their mismanagement of China, which includes, of course, things like high inflation, which he saw daily in his life in Guangzhou. Also, he saw many criminal elements things that he considered criminal elements like brothels, gambling dens, and he essentially saw what he believed to be lawlessness under the nationalists. And of course, we know that the nationalists also had a very hard time bringing regions that they claimed to be part of the Republic of China under their control, and that includes regions like Xinjiang, Tibet, which had become independent by that point. Mongolia was independent. And so part of this idea of China as a whole was still absent, I think, even under the nationalist government as they were fighting the communists. And so my father believed in the communist mission. He goes north to Beijing to attend agricultural university, and because he believes the heart of the revolution is in Beijing, the new capital. And while his brother Sam, 4 years older, takes a scholarship from the United States and goes off to do more studies, higher education in the United States, in Washington at George Washington University. So these two brothers take these separate paths. My father goes up to Beijing, and he marches in the first anniversary parade of the PRC in Tiananmen Square as Mao and his comrades are waving to them from the rostrum. He's there with students, with military soldiers, and with factory workers, and they march down Chang'an Avenue, and he remembers that moment very vividly. And within weeks, he decides to enroll in the military and drop out of university because China has entered the Korean War, and Mao is exhorting young Chinese to serve the motherland and to protect it from the American forces on the peninsula. And Mao at this point is very much emphasizing the American part of the war. The slogans that they were putting out weren't to defend North Korea as much as it was to defeat the American imperialists. And Mao's message, his very public message, was that if the Americans defeated the North Koreans and the Chinese forces helping them on the peninsula, then they would cross the Yalu River and march onward to Beijing, depose Mao Zedong, and reinstall Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists in power. We know from historical documents that some people in the American military establishment did want to do that, MacArthur namely, and Truman had to pull him back from crossing the Yalu River at one point when they had a lot of success on the Korean Peninsula before a mass influx of Chinese forces pushed them further south. So my father signs on to the military. He's sent off to the northeast to both Changchun and Harbin in Manchuria, the homeland of the Manchus who established the Qing dynasty. And there he trains for the Air Force, a new part of the military that's being formed. And he's in a academy to train bomber squadrons up in Harbin at an Air Force Institute, one that still exists today. But within weeks of enrolling in that academy and starting his training, he's pulled aside along with a few other classmates and told that instead of staying in the Air Force, he's going to be placed in the PLA, in the main body of the army, and sent out west. And so he thinks something is wrong with the track he's on at the time. He's not really sure why he's being moved, especially since the Chinese need to send so many people to Korea. But he accepts this mission because it's still part of the military and he doesn't have much choice at that time. He knows that the PLA and the party are trying to bring huge parts of Western China under their control, namely Xinjiang and Tibet, which the Manchus had put under the Qing Empire. And so he takes a series of trucks and trains out to pass the end of the western end of the Ming Great Wall in Gansu Province, past the Jade Gate, and out into what used to be known as the Western regions, places of exile for many interior Chinese. But he ends up out in Xinjiang and in the PLA in Xinjiang. His first mission out there is to be placed in Altai, which is an area on the border today of Mongolia, Russia, and Kazakhstan. And he's among a half dozen Han soldiers who are sent up there and in the wintertime and placed with a Kazakh militia unit. And this Kazakh militia unit, mostly Kazakhs, there were some Uyghur soldiers in it, but they were part of the Ili National Army, which had been an army that had formed during the nationalist period and have been backed by the Soviets in order to try and overthrow what forms of nationalist control there were. The forms were loose, the nationalists didn't have a tight control of Xinjiang, and this army was one of the ones that was fighting the nationalists. Now, after the communists took over, they knew that there were some independence-oriented or nationalistic elements within these militias. And according to my father, part of their mission was to both indoctrinate the militias into communist ideology, as well as help merge the militias into the PLA so that the militias would be part of the PLA and not on their own. And so he went out there. There was some violence in parts of Xinjiang at that time. Right around that time, there was a Kazakh-led insurgency. There was a Kazakh militiaman named Osman Batur who led a small insurgency against the communists, and they suppressed insurgency, eventually captured Osman and executed him in public in Urumqi. My father is not part of that, but these were events that were going in parallel with his time there. So he would be in these daily sessions indoctrinating Kazakhs, and eventually that militia is broken up and put into the PLA, into this form called the Fifth Army, which then eventually gets put into other military forms of control out in Xinjiang, including the early Binguan system. So my father gets sent to different parts of Xinjiang in the northwest. I don't have any photos from that period when he was out there. This is me. These are photos that were taken by a photographer who went with me to Xinjiang in 2014 as I was trying to trace some of my father's footsteps and the army unit and find out more about the army units he was with. This is in the Altai region, and there are still Kazakhs who do herding out there, though there are no longer any true nomads out there. They live a more semi-nomadic or settled lifestyle out there. But this was the region that he was posted in, and then he gets put into Yining and the Ili Valley right after his time in Altai. And it's interesting, at that time that he was out there, in these early 1950s years, the political officer who was in charge of the entire region was Xi Jinping's father, Xi Zhongxun. So the military commander at the beginning was a man named Wang Jun, who took a very hardline approach to controlling the different ethnic groups and militias that were out there. Xi Zhongxun was put into his position by Mao. The two had known each other from their time together in the northwest base of Yan'an during the Chinese Civil War. And Mao and the elder Xi had these discussions about how to best control the region and bring the different groups out there into the communist ideology and to loyalty to the party. And so during the early 1950s, when the elder Xi was in charge, they would vacillate between harder approaches to Xinjiang and softer approaches. They would sometimes let up on some of the land appropriation policies where they would take land from religious institutions and herders, and other times they would go harder on that. My father remembers one year when he was based out in the Yining area that they decided to relent on some of the harder line policies. And he was told for most of that year not to interact with the local population, not to interact with the Kazakhs and the Uyghurs that were in that area, because they wanted to minimize any friction that was taking place between the Han military occupation in the area and the locals. And so he and a Uyghur soldier that was serving with him in his unit were told to spend most of their time in their post, in their base in Yining, rather than going out and interacting with the population. At another point, he is told to do more propaganda work for the party, and at one posting in that same area, he is told to go out and spend time with Kazakh soldiers and workers who are posted in the Ili Valley, and his mission is to find Kazakh men who would be appropriate model workers for a senior military officer to promote and to put out there as model workers for other Kazakhs to follow and to emulate. So that was part of this indoctrination propaganda campaign that he was part of, and that was very different than the period when he was told not to interact with the population. His final posting in Xinjiang was to an area called Wenchuan, which is much closer to the border with Soviet Kazakhstan. And again, this was another Kazakh, mainly Kazakh herding area up in the mountains. And he was put into one of the very first Binguan, or military farming garrisons, that was formed in Xinjiang starting from 1952 to 1954, when they were starting to put the system together. And the farming garrisons, I think, were a later form of a type of agricultural garrison that the Manchus and the Manchu troops had started when they had taken over parts of Xinjiang. They needed to produce enough food to feed the many troops that were out there, the different units. And it was also a form of keeping troops stationed out in the region in order to have presence out there. So there was these early garrisons. My father was put into one where most of the work he did was ranching and herding. He calls it a ranch. And they were herding sheep and other animals, similar to what the Kazakhs around them were doing. And as we know, the modern day Binguan has become a very vast system that is its own entity that exists in parallel with many other government agencies. And they're widespread throughout Xinjiang. The most famous one is one called Shehuzi that I visited when I was a reporter there. And they produce many different types of products, including things that we find on store shelves in America or in Europe, products like tomato paste, for example. So and of course, some of the current policy debate in the Biden administration, and that started under the Trump administration, was to try and pinpoint products made in these Binguan and to establish bans on the import of these types of products. And so that's a current policy debate that goes on and has its roots in the system that my father witnessed. In 1957, my father gets the opportunity to go back into interior China. He had thought he would have to live out the rest of his life in Xinjiang, but there's a call for young people to try and go back to university to help build up industrial China. And so he goes back, he goes to an aeronautics university affiliated with the PLA in Xi'an, studies aeronautics engineering. So he's then in the university when the Great Famine happens. He survives it, although he starves along with many of his classmates. And because of that, and because he also discovers that the party still has suspicions of him because of his background as the son of a merchant family from Hong Kong, and as the brother of someone who went off to America to study in America and eventually work for the American military as an engineer. He has this dossier on him from the party. It's part of his Dang'an that he can't shake, and he realizes he'll never become a party member, which he has aspired to be, even though he had spent all these years out in the northwest frontier for China. And so he then constructs this elaborate plan to escape back to Hong Kong at a period when many other Chinese in the early 60s were trying to flee China because of the famine and because of the economic hardships. And so many Chinese were trying to swim across the waters from Guangdong to Hong Kong and dying on the way. My father manages to get an exit document from a police officer in Guangzhou where he has family connections. And he uses this document to instead go to Macau in 1962. And then from Macau, which is was a Portuguese colony at the time, from Macau he then exits to Hong Kong in early 1963. So his story closes. His story closes on the PRC. He moves from Hong Kong to America in 1967, bringing his grandmother with him, joining his older brother, and that's where my sister and I are born and spent our childhood. He comes back to China three times. Twice after I moved there for the New York Times. He visits me in 2009 when I get married. He also visits me in 2012 when my daughter is born. And he has a lot, he shares with me a lot of thoughts on Xi Jinping taking over rule of China at the time when he returns, telling me that he believes at that point that there's a lot of corruption in the party. In his assessment, the party in 2012 is even more corrupt than the nationalists were when he was growing up, because the scale of accumulated wealth by party officials is just much larger than it was back in the 1930s to 1940s. And his hope is that Xi Jinping will bring the party under control, help unify, all the parts of the system that have gotten frayed throughout some of the reform and opening era, but also continue to push China on this road of reform and opening and economic development. As we know, that hasn't quite gone the way of China. China hasn't quite gone that way. Xi Jinping has instead taken control of a different form of nationalism, one that in some ways is similar, I think, to what my father had been part of. Part of Xi's vision of a nationalist China, of a reunified China, is to ensure control over all the former Qing territories, over Xinjiang, over Tibet. What I reported on, starting from 2008 when I arrived there, and then accelerating in 2014 with policies that Xi pushed down, were these policies of coercive assimilation of different ethnic groups in those regions, in particular the Uyghur and Kazakh Muslims out in Xinjiang, the same people that my father had worked among. And whereas in my father's time, there was more debate, I think, about the direction of policies, now Xi has taken the policies in a single direction out there. And we've seen the establishment of the internment camps, technological surveillance, and other things that you've read about. But those are policies that Xi has undertaken that part. He increasingly talks about Taiwan and bringing Taiwan under the control of the communists. I think that's also part of this idea of reconstituting the Qing Empire. Taiwan, as we know, was brought under Qing control in the late 19th century and was the second area in those frontier areas to be labeled an official province of the empire. Xinjiang, I think, was the first one of those inner Asian or outer areas to be put into this official province bureaucratic name, and that was in the late 19th century after the Qing had controlled it for a while. And so I think a lot of the issues that we see that are friction points between China and other countries, including the United States, and in U.S.-China relations, which is what I covered today, are very much related to this core mission of the party, which is to both firm up control over what the Qing had built up as this inner Asian empire, and to, in some ways, expand it. So they're tightening control in the northwest, in Xinjiang, tightening control over Tibet. Xi brought the party secretary of Tibet up to Xinjiang in order to implement some of the same control policies starting in 2016, Chen Chuanguo. And then, bringing Hong Kong under the system of governance that the party has, and then keeping an eye on Taiwan, and in some way, and expanding out further in some ways beyond what the Qing had envisioned, pushing outwards into the South China Sea and claiming that as their territory. So I believe that this is a core mission of the party. It is, I don't think that that's surprising to many of the people in this room, but I do think that it is something that policymakers in Washington are going to increasingly grapple with. And it is something that, it's a framing, I think, of their policy drive that gets less attention than ideas of the party trying to maintain legitimacy through economic growth, for example. But I do think that under Xi Jinping, this has come much more to the fore, as well as the idea of a national security state. And I think in the last few years, we've seen Xi emphasizing state security and national security, and even making the argument, he and some of his colleagues make the argument that the economic liberalization policies in reform and opening were undermining state security. And now China has to harness state security once again in order to keep the country and the party whole. Part of the idea dates back, I think, to Xi's obsession with the downfall of the Soviet Union, and he thinks that the loosening of party control and security measures internally led to the breakup of the Soviet Union, and he's talked repeatedly about that in internal party speeches. He has also talked about it directly with Biden. When Biden made a trip to China in 2011, the two had dinner in Chengdu. And when I was researching my book, a person who was present, a U.S. official who was present at that dinner, told me that Xi brought up the breakup of the Soviet Union to Biden, and made the argument that the Soviet Union broke up because of weak leadership and weak control over that form of the nation state or the empire, and that Xi wouldn't let that happen to China, and Xi wouldn't let that happen to the party in China. So we know that that's a obsession of Xi's, and I think that will color much of his governance going forward. His emphasis on state security and national security state is very familiar to my father, because part of that includes being watchful for foreign elements that the party deems subversive to the mission of the party state. And so my father was one of the people who could never win the trust of the party because of his family background. And now we're seeing the party re-emphasizing this hunt for foreign elements within China and making sure that it roots out various subversive elements. And one recent manifestation of that is that Xi Jinping has empowered the Ministry of State Security, which operates counterintelligence operations, to publicize cases where it has caught people it deems to be foreign spies or assets of foreign spy agencies, and also to start putting out public campaigns where it encourages Chinese citizens to report on any such occurrences to them. So once again, there are some echoes of some of the nationalistic drives that my father experienced in today's China. And so I'm happy to talk more about these issues and questions with Mark and with all of you. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ed. You've kind of given away the ending of the book, but let me recommend the book nonetheless, even though you know how it comes out and has a very happy ending, obviously. It's really a fascinating story, or set of stories, really, and quite well told and artfully interwoven with your own reporting experiences in a lot of the places where you discover that your father actually had been, but you did not maybe know at first, and then sort of learned about those. So I have a number of things that were on my mind as I was reading the book over the weekend, and just now making a few additional notes. And maybe I'll start just by sharing some of my own first reactions as I was reading about your father's experience. That really comes through so strongly here. And I kept on thinking about your father as an exile. He wasn't officially exiled, but it seemed to me he was definitely unofficially sent into exile. And first he's sent to Manchuria, to Dongbei, right? He gets sent, I think he's sent to Harbin, right?
Right, Changchun and the Harbin.
Changchun first, right? I remember there's a description of Sedaling Dajie,
Yeah.
which a lot of these places I've been to, so it was kind of fun to see them show up in the book. And I want to ask you about one of those places in a minute. So he goes to Manchuria, which in the early Qing, was where people who were not trusted by the state were sent. So those who had resisted Qing rule in the middle of the 17th century, particularly literati from Jiangnan or other parts of the country, where they did not agree to serve the Qing, And if they were not killed, they were taken and then sent into exile in the frozen north. And we have their records in many cases. We have the memoirs of some of these people, which is a very valuable source for us now for understanding what life was like there. And life was certainly not easy. But exile to Manchuria probably was a picnic. I mean, Harbin, at least, is a regular city compared to exile to Dzungaria. I mean, he's sent to the far, I mean, really, it really is the edge of empire. I mean, he could have, and I think at one point you say he even deliberated about maybe walking into Kazakhstan, because he could have walked into Kazakhstan. It wouldn't have taken him a day.
Right.
He could have done that. So, and that was a place where, in the middle of the Qing dynasty, because everything I read, of course, has to have a reference to the Qing dynasty.
This is why I want to take your course right here.
In the middle of the Qing, Xinjiang, as it was called after 1759, is where exiles are sent, typically. The most famous official, of course, exiled to Xinjiang was Lin Zexu for his failure to stop the opium disaster in Guangzhou. He's sent out to the far northwest. So it seemed to me then that your dad, who was, and he didn't learn at the beginning that the reason that he was being sent to these places. I mean, at first it's because he wants to join the Air Force, and that's where the training is going to happen. But it becomes pretty clear that's not going to be his future. And it's only later where he accidentally gets access to his dossier that he finds out what the story is, right? And he realizes that he's, in fact, suspect, which I think reading the book, and you listening him probably, you could have told him, didn't you think that having a brother studying in the United States would be a problem for joining the party in early 1950s, mid-1950s? It seems obvious now, but people didn't know then, right? So exile as a theme here seems so strong to me, and you used the word just now, actually. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that, even in the South, I mean, in the Tang and the Song, that's where people were sent, right? Before that was fully incorporated into the empire, and that's where your family is from. Right. So I was thinking about exile and frontiers, right? A lot of this book happens on the frontier, and that's what frontiers are for. If you're an empire, right? That's why you need the frontier. You need a place where you can send people to get them away, to put them. They're still within your reach, but they're at a safe distance from being able to cause any trouble. So that was part of your theme here about empire, which was, I think, one of the things that we want to talk about. And we'll speak for, 15 or 20 minutes maybe, and then we'll open things up to questions. I wanted to ask you, because I got into this field in part because of my own experience of the frontier. I was not exiled, except perhaps in a form of self-exile, I suppose. You describe your experience at Sairam Lake.
Right. Yeah. Which I crossed several times, and my father crossed several times.
Yeah. So I've only ever been there once. So this is a beautiful, beautiful place. I mean, let's not forget, frontiers, places of exile. They're cold. They're forbidding. Life is hard there, but they're also very beautiful. Naturally, quite beautiful, many of them. And I wondered your thoughts as you were going to the places that your father went to, and like Sairam especially, on the way to Gulja, to Ining, where he lived. It's quite striking, the mountains around the lake, Kazakhs camped around. Mm-hmm. You rode a horse, I rode a horse, you stayed in a ger, I stayed in a ger. I'm not sure why we didn't run into each other while we were there, but...
and I did mine right after leaving Berkeley in 1999. So
yeah, okay, well, you were there long before me, and I'm sure you were a better writer than I am. But what was your experience of the frontier, going back and tracing your father's footsteps?
Yeah, that trip, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the lake, because that trip was the very first one where I tried to trace my father's footsteps. And I just talked with my father about his background, as part of a research for a student project at Berkeley. I had no idea what Xinjiang was like. He told me he had been out there. He described it in broad detail. So after I finished grad school, I wanted to make this overland journey, starting in Hong Kong, where my family roots are, going through China overland to India. I would end it in Delhi. And the heart of that journey would be going through Xinjiang into Pakistan. And so I ended up going along the Hexi corridor in Gansu province, which is, the passage to exile that many Chinese had taken over the centuries. Officials who were sent out to exile would have to make this passage westward along this corridor of high plateauing mountains.
Out the Jade Gate.
Yeah, out the Jade Gate, beyond Jiayuguan. Jiayuguan is on the cover of the book, and then the westernmost fortress in the Ming era Great Wall, and then the Jade Gate, which predates that as this marking point between the western regions.
That's a Han.
The Han, right, the Han era post. And so then my father went out there, I went out, took buses beyond that, the Jade Gate, ended up in Urumqi, and then I decided, instead of, many people can go at that time, backpackers, other people go onward straight from there to Kashgar. But I knew my father had gone out to the Kazakh areas into Golja, Yining, and the Ili Valley. And so I decided to take buses from Urumqi out up to northwest. And Sairam Lake that you mentioned is kind of a crossroads plateau area in that journey to the Ili Valley. And you can go northward into Jungaria from there. And so going from Urumqi, which, as some of you know, is this very modern city with a small Uyghur town in the center, northwest, and arriving at this lake, that was truly my first encounter I felt with this northwest frontier area, because as you so eloquently described, Mark, it is this beautiful, large freshwater alpine lake surrounded by forest hills and many gurs dotted along the shore of the lake, which I had never seen before, along with Kazakh herders, maybe some Mongols among them, and camels too, Bactrian camels, which was incredible to me. So there you have in microcosm this sense of Central Asia right there, and you instantly know you're not in the interior.
You're not in Kansas anymore.
Yeah, exactly. And then I realized this must have been what my father experienced. This was 6 years of his life, was exactly in an environment like that. I eventually went from the lake up to Yining, which at that time still had a very heavy Russian influence. There was lettering in
there was Russian consulate.
Yeah,
for many years there.
Yeah, in Yining or Golja. And of course, in the late 1990s, there had been an incident of ethnic violence and unrest very recently in Golja. So the presence of the police, the security forces, is very omnipresent throughout Golja. And if you speak with Uyghurs today who are from that area, there is a long shared history of what happened in the late 1990s in Golja. So I was already sensing some of these friction points that existed in that frontier region, and that, of course, date back to my father's time going out there. One thing that I thought was interesting in my research with my father, when I asked him about his time out there and his first encounters with these different, people of different ethnic groups, was that he never told me about any tensions that existed out there when he arrived in Altai and other regions. But I found this letter late in my research process that he had written to his older brother who was in America at the time. And he wrote this letter after he had escaped to Hong Kong in the early 1960s. And he was recounting, his life experience in those 12 years in the PRC. And in the part where he talks about going out to the frontier, he says, I arrived out in Xinjiang. It was this remarkable place with 15 or so different ethnic groups that I could discern, different languages, different perspectives, different cultural outlooks. But I discovered that many of the people among them shared one thing, which was an intense hatred and suspicion of the Han people. And so even when he first went out there, when he was traveling through places like Sairam Lake or Altai, he already had the sense that, the people out there saw many of the Han who are coming out as these conquerors or as interlopers. And I think in that letter, he attributes those tensions, that hatred, to policies that were imposed on the region by warlords that ruled the region or nationalist commanders who were trying to impose control on the region. And I think when he got out there, he thought the communists can do it better, the PLA and the party can do it better, and we can somehow figure out how to integrate these groups and these people into our project of nationalism and communism, while others before us had failed before. And of course, as we know from recent history, that hasn't quite been the case.
Yeah, not quite. Yeah, I wonder, in terms of the memories, if the memories that people had may not have been limited to the period of rule by Sheng Shizai or Yang Zengxin or nationalists, but also even memories of the late 19th century, because this is 1950, so there would have been older people around who would have been alive in the 1880s potentially. It would have been children then,
right,
which was when the Qing reasserted control over the region, particularly in the south, less so in Dzungaria, but more in Altasher in the southern part of Xinjiang, which is where most of the Uyghur population is concentrated, although Gulzhou was definitely part of this. And that's when the Xiang army under Zuo Zongtang reconquered, the Reconquista, we call it in seminars, right, here. After the Republic not the Republic, but the Sultanate of Yaqub Beg had failed, right? So, and those were very assimilationist policies.
Right.
There's a relatively new book by a former student of mine, Eric Schlussel, called Land of Strangers, that explores this particular issue. I think I saw it, in fact, here in the bibliography.
Yeah.
So thank you for. I'm really happy to see that some of that work has
right,
made it in there.
I mean, Mark, a lot of, as you know, like a lot of the new Qing historians had a huge influence on me. I was writing this book. I had read Manchu Wei. I read Peter Perdue's book.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Others.
Yeah. Well, the Inner Asia appears as a term in here, is of course warms my heart. We wanted to talk about empire. I want to talk about that a little bit, and then maybe we move to questions. The title of the presentation today, The Empire Reborn. You frequently come back to this theme in the book of the PRC effort to reconstitute empire, rebuild empire. We're all familiar with the notion of rebirth or rejuvenation. Fuxing is a term that's been used a lot, even before Xi Jinping came to power. But of course, no one talks about the restoration or the rejuvenation of the great Chinese empire.
Yeah.
That's not a term that most people think positively of
right.
today.
And in fact, as we know, the party likes to use the term empire as a counterpoint to China's projects.
Right, exactly. So
victims of empire.
Right. So my question for you is, in your title and in your thinking about this, is your use of empire, are we to understand this in a figurative sense, or are we to understand it in a more literal sense?
I think somewhere in between, I would say. And I don't have a strict political science definition of empire. That's not what I'm working with here. I know that, some scholars...
This is not a gotcha moment, don't worry.
Right. I know some scholars like to debate, what exactly defines an empire. And in my mind, having covered, many international events and covering U.S. foreign policy now, it becomes evident, I think, when a modern nation state takes the form of an empire. And I argue, in the prologue that the U.S. is an empire, and that part of my perspective is based on the fact that I reported in Iraq from 2003, 2007, and essentially saw, the most coercive workings of empire, the American empire in that form when I was reporting on that. And people have written about how the U.S. maintains its imperial reach with its many military bases around the world, its command of the dollar as a reserve currency in the world, and the use of sanctions that allows the U.S. to impose on the country. So there are different forms that empires can take, I think, in this area of republics and modern nation states. And I think that the Communist Party, their project, is a combination of that in some ways, like they, in a very material way. Like they have reconstituted the type of vast land or sea empire that ruled the world between the 17th and 19th centuries, like the type of empire that the Ottomans had, or that the Russians had, or that the British had, or that the French had. The communists succeeded in reconstituting most of the territory of that type of empire. And as my father experienced and was part of, had to use coercive means in order to maintain control over parts of that at different points of communist rule. So my father is part of what was very clearly a military occupation, like reconquest and occupation of Xinjiang, and then another part of the PLA went into Tibet, and taking over that large swath of what's today Western China, what back then in that era was either independent, de facto independent, or quasi-independent areas, was very much a part of bringing this vast land empire back under the control of a central authority. And at the same time, I think that today the party is trying to adopt the American form of empire as well, where it wants to displace America from its dominance in the series of institutions that it's built up after World War II, and wants to be the more dominant player in international institutions and set up its own military bases around the world to project power. I don't think that that's as important an objective as maintaining military superiority as well as internal control in the areas of Asia.
Yeah, yeah, interesting. I think I mostly agree with you, and I do. I mean, there are many aspects of what you describe here and of what we have seen in the years since, because this book focuses both on the really on the 50s and then the 90s and up to the 20-teens, really,
right,
when you finish your reporting at the Times most recently. So there are a lot of aspects of what we see that kind of feel like empire or look like empire. The military occupation, for instance, the use of agricultural farms. The Binguan are frequently described as a modern version of the Tuntian system. The Qing didn't actually use that because the Qing soldiers on the border didn't farm. They were soldiers. There were others who did the farming, but certainly they were there for occupation. There are and the expansion. I mean, we think of empires as having to expand. That's a dynamic of extending control that feels like this is an empire at work. Although, of course, it's not framed that way, right? It's framed in the discourse of unification everywhere,
right, or reunification,
and particularly reunification. Yeah. It's interesting. I was looking at some stuff just the other day, and in English, in Chinese it was 统一, but in English it was reunification. Mm-hmm. So right. There's no 再统一.
It was a Chinese source that had it was a Chinese
with its own English translation.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah. So, but there are. It seems to me, and I wonder what your response will be. There are other things here that don't feel like empire to me. So we have, for instance, in general, some of the more recent literature, and there's a book I'm sure you may have looked at it, Burbank and Cooper, Jane Burbank and Fred Cooper's book on empire, where they say that the concept of empire is that different people within the polity will be ruled differently.
Right.
And that empire is a lot about the management of difference, and that there's no urge to homogenize things. There's a tolerance for. I mean, the Mongol Empire is the classic example that people like to give. That there's layered or nested sovereignties of different sorts, and all of that kind of thing.
Right.
Tolerance
and the
for
Qing
languages.
is another.
The
good
Qing
example.
is very much in that model, and that's not what we're seeing now.
Right.
I mean, you made a reference a minute ago to the new direction that ethnic policy in China is taking, which is something I'm actually working on and have something I'm hoping to, some writing I hope to finish soon, on this, the forging of a shared ethnic Chinese consciousness. 注劳中华民族共同体意识. This is the new Tifa. This is the new way of talking about ethnicity. It's not 多元 anymore. The pluralism era is over, and it's now the 统一 era that we're entering. And we're seeing all kinds of evidence of assimilation and an intolerance of difference.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that you've got aspects of empire, but you also have a lot of the tension that we've seen throughout all of modern or 20th century Chinese history between the demands of a nation state and the requirements of empire, and the real difficulty in reconciling those two things. And I wonder whether you would agree and what you...
No, I totally agree with that, Mark. I think that, part of the tensions that exist right now internally within China is the fact that they are trying to govern the territory of what had been this vast land empire with very distinct ethnic groups that had dominion or sway over large parts of the land. But in the context of a republic or a nation state in which you have to create this like shared history, shared culture across the land. And of course, as in the early 50s, there was some debate, and it shows up in places like the Chinese Constitution about how there should be autonomous areas.
Yeah, it's in the Constitution.
And it's in the Constitution, it's in the name of these regions. But I think that, as the decades went on, the party moved further and further away from that concept of more individualized governance in these large areas. And then when...
And that's where the Soviet example that you mentioned, I think, really kicks in. Right?
Yeah, the Soviet example kicks in, and then they were also... I think that in contemporary China, Xi Jinping has looked at some of the Soviet efforts and then also thought we need to do it our own way, which is move in a much more hardline assimilationist model, even though the Soviets obviously had a lot of central control over those areas, but they were the ones who came up with this idea of labeling these autonomous areas. And I think that Xi's idea is that the breakup of the Soviet Union was in part rooted in some of that labeling.
Yeah, I was struck by that. It's so interesting because I don't know, most of what I've read suggests that that's not why the Soviet Union fell apart. It fell apart because it was economically completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
The ethnic thing didn't help, but it wasn't what drove it. But Xi Jinping seems to think differently.
Yeah, I think he seems to think that, and I think that plays into the, his efforts at promoting a much more assimilationist policy, which becomes evident, for example, in the Xinjiang context in 2014.
Tragically so.
That work conference.
Yes, exactly, that work conference. And this is where this new policy is first actually announced, this formulation we hear for the...
Yeah, I think 2014 is that pivotal year.
Yeah,
right, and that's right after, it takes place, I think shortly after Xi makes a visit to Urumqi, and then there's a violent attack in Urumqi at that time, and they're grappling with these violent incidents that have been taking place across the region.
So one last question for you before we open up to the audience. Your father, you say, learned Uyghur and some Kazakh when he was there.
Yeah. He doesn't remember any of it.
I wasn't going to ask that. That's always I hate that question. People ask me that question. But that's a very unusual move, in my experience, when I've met with Han who have traveled in these regions or lived there. As far as we know, very, very few, if any, of the Qing intellectuals, literati, who were sent to go either as officials or in exile to work in Lhasa, where there was a Qing, there were ambans, the representatives of the emperor, or in other places. They never bothered to learn the local language. Local, Han merchants who go out to work in Urumqi or Kashgar or wherever they go, rarely, if ever. And your father did.
Yeah. But
I was really impressed by that.
Right. I think he learned it environmentally, like by interacting with, for example, he lived for a year in one posting in the Ili Valley with a Uyghur soldier who was his roommate. They shared a room. And so I think he learned it by osmosis through interactions like that. And
Well, I know lots of examples of people in that situation who don't pick it up through osmosis, and I'm sure you guys probably know examples of that too.
And also because his unit was placed within this Fifth Army that was composed of Kazakh and Uyghur militiamen. And it turns out the reason why he and these other Han soldiers later on he discovers were placed there was because the Han who are more suspect are put into these parts of the PLA to work with non-Han soldiers, and ex-Taiwanese soldiers are also put.
Yes, of course.
Ex-KMT, not
ex-KMT. They make up the vast majority of Binguan.
Yeah, are placed into these areas and eventually into Binguan as well. So, right.
Well, it just gives us all more reason to come back again to confirm what I always like to tell students, which is that the frontier is where you see how the empire is put together. It's where the sausage is made. And we see that sausage making going on, and a lot of it's not very pretty in this book, and your father paid a price for that. He was lucky, I think, in the end. I don't know if he would say so, and maybe it's unfair of me to say it, but he manages to leave. He gets back to Hong Kong,
right,
where he was born.
Yeah, and it's interesting when I spoke with him about those years that he spent out there, those 6 or 7 years that he spent in Xinjiang. In the current context, in his late 80s, he doesn't have in his mind a lot of regrets about that period. And in fact, looks back on it with some sense of nostalgia because of the simplicity of life that he led out there, and because, as you pointed out at the beginning of this talk, that there is a beauty to those areas. But then when I go back and read the letters that he wrote to Sam, there are some very sharp regrets expressed in those letters in the early 60s after he gets out of China, in which he says, these dozen years that I spent in China, they were all for nothing.
Wasted.
Yeah, they were all wasted. So,
well, given his hope had been to join the party and contribute to the building of the nation, it was still a hopeful time in the PRC for many people, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that nostalgia sounds a lot to me like what I've heard from many of my friends who were sent down youth in the Cultural Revolution, who went to Mongolia, or they were often sent to the frontier. Again, that's what frontiers are for. And they were hard years, but they look back on those years with a great deal, many of them anyway, of fondness and a longing for the simplicity of the life that they knew. Of course, we all look back or many of us, on our years in our late teens, early 20s, and how beautiful they were. If only we had known what we knew later. Yeah. Well, there's much more to be unpacked here, but I think now would be a good time to open things up for questions from the audience. So I would like to ask you, if you do have a question, to please approach a microphone if you can. Do we have?
Can I open with a question for you, Mark? Because I wanted to.
I'm not sure. Is that in the rules?
Right. Because when we were talking before the talk, we talked about the discontinuity of ideas of China, like how in reality there's a discontinuous China, but of course in imperial conceptions and then in the party conception there is this continuous history of China, and so that is how rejuvenation of empire, or reconstitution of empire, or great Chinese states are formed in terms of the popular imagination. I'm just wondering, based on all your studies, like how you summarize, especially when you're talking students, the idea of a Chinese polity, when in fact there are many different forms of China that have taken place throughout history, and notably the Qing, as we just talked about, had a very unique form of imperial governance that encompassed interior China, what we often think of as China, but also all these other territories that are very different than interior China.
Well, I think that I'll give a very brief answer. I think you've said it quite well. I mean, the idea of China is very, very old. Nobody would, I think, argue otherwise. Part of the problem comes in nomenclature, in that the phrase that we use for China today, 中国, has many different meanings in different periods and different contexts. And my colleague Peter Bohl has an excellent paper on the central states, plural, not a single state, but a collection of states that are in the middle, and it's always in reference to the states on the outside. So I think that the governing notion here in terms of the polity in this part of the world that is probably most useful is 天下. Okay, that has a long history, and wherever you're from, whether you're from the Neidi or from the Zhongyuan or whatever we want to call the central part of China, which itself also, of course, moves, you're aware of what 天下 is, and of all the good things that accrue to the person who is in control of 天下. And the Manchus are certainly perfectly aware of that. They don't think of themselves as Chinese, at least not in the beginning, and certainly the Han subject of the Ming didn't think of them as Chinese either. But they come around to the idea, and they adopt the notion that the rule of 天下 belongs to the man of virtue, and that's the claim that they make. And the early emperors took that rather seriously. But there are other claims that they were able to make about ruling other parts of the empire, right? So that's where we don't see that sort of plurality of types of discourse of sovereignty today. But the idea of a single China is certainly there. The difficulty is reconciling 天下 with nation. And this is actually a problem that Joseph Levinson, who was Fred Wakeman's teacher, and a student of John Fairbank. Levinson identified this problem back in the 1950s, very soon after the revolution. In large part, he writes, the history of modern China is the story of trying to reconcile, of the transition from 天下 to 国家, from 天下 to nation. And again, these terms are difficult to translate, but I think we're still seeing this process unfold.
Right. Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks for letting me have the first question.
Sure. So, if I may trouble you, we have two mics, one here, one here. This is for the recording so that we can get the question and the answer. Thank you. Please, sir.
Edward, my name is Paul Pressman. I am a friend of your cousin, the Mars, and I first met you at your talk at their house roughly 8 years ago, and I felt privileged to be there and have read very closely all of your Times stories since then, which I marvel at because you're in so many different countries and so many different issues have to be dealt with. Well, my question really is about loyalty. As an architecture student in the 70s at MIT, I worked on quite a number of laboratory buildings at that institution. And at that time, a goodly number of the scientists from China who had come over to be professors there were accused of smuggling information back to the Chinese government, that their purposes were really not educational, but they were spies. They were educational or industrial spies, and they were removed from the United States. So when I read things that you write or things that another reporter of note, Evan Osnos from the New Yorker writes, I think to myself, do they have to weigh whether they can say what they really would like to write, lest they be kicked out of China if they write things that are too critical, too damaging, too revealing of secrets that they would rather not have America and the West know? So how do you walk that line? How do you maintain your status as a permitted journalist from the West without getting into that kind of trouble? And we know that recently there have been quite a few journalists who have been removed from the countries they were reporting on, or worse, murdered.
Yeah.
Right.
Excellent question.
And of course, China is one of the nations that has evicted large numbers of foreign journalists. I would say that I came to China as a reporter in 2008, left at the end of 2016, and have gone back on several reporting trips since. But the phenomenon you're describing of the government putting intense pressure on foreign journalists over coverage changed over that time. When I arrived, I did not feel an intense amount of pressure or scrutiny on my stories. And foreign journalists will get called in to have conversations with mainly foreign ministry officials, sometimes police officials, about their coverage.
Are these drink tea conversations?
Yeah, they're drink tea conversations. And the first time that happened to me with the foreign ministry was actually on a reporting trip to a frontier area. I was in a Tibetan area in 2009 trying to reach a place called Kirti Monastery, where a Tibetan monk had just committed self-immolation in order to protest Chinese policies. And it was the first of what would be a large wave of self-immolations, but I was arrested by the police in the area, then essentially forced to go back to Beijing, and then the foreign ministry called me in for a lecture. I received a lecture, but I never felt that I had to curb my reporting on Tibet, on Xinjiang, or on any other issues in China. I think I knew that part of this back and forth was that they would have to deliver these lectures to you. You would take it in, but you would keep on doing your reporting. I would say that the first notable exception to that in terms of coverage that I discovered in the New York Times system was when a colleague of mine, David Barboza, did an investigative story on the family wealth of Wen Jiabao. And it was I think, several thousand words. It went to forensic detail on how his family accumulated a lot of wealth, and the party became very sensitive to that type of reporting, whether it was by the New York Times, by Bloomberg, or by others, because I think they felt that that touched a very raw red line that they didn't want journalists to cross, which is essentially exposing in undeniable detail the forms of wealth accumulation and corruption that had taken place at the top levels of the party. And so there was intense pressure on David and on the New York Times as a whole when that came out. But even then, we could more or less weather that. And the breaking point came in early 2020, right when the pandemic started. There was back and forth that involved the US government under the Trump administration actually evicting some Chinese journalists, and then China retaliated by evicting most of the journalists, American journalists, for the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And to this day, those same journalists cannot get long-term visas to go back to China. And the number of foreign journalists at China is probably at an all-time low in this 1990s to 2000s period. So they've exerted now enormous pressure on journalists, but I still sense that the ones who are able to work in China are not self-censoring or curbing the type of coverage they're doing. And essentially what it has forced us to do is to do a lot of China coverage from outside of China. So one of the very best journalists working on China today, Chris Buckley, is reporting from Taiwan and earlier from Australia rather than from China because he just can't get a visa to go back in China. But it hasn't, he hasn't softened his coverage in order to try and win back that visa or get back into the graces of officials in China.
Yeah, it's really remarkable and a sad commentary that at the time when we really need much more understanding between the U.S. and China, we have the lowest number of reporters, at least American reporters in the country that anybody can remember, and the smallest number of students in the country that anybody can remember. I think we have another question over here.
Could I follow up with a brief one?
I'm sorry, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you. You can follow up later?
Yeah, I'll talk to you after.
Offline? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I loved it. My name is Aaron Molnar, and I'm a postdoc at Harvard's Center for the Environment. And I want to pick up on something that Mark had mentioned in his initial comments, and that's the concept of exile, to sort of tie the imperial period with your father's own very intimate experience with the Chinese state. For those of us that study, like me, the borderlands of China, we're we're very aware of exile as being a key component to this idea of frontier and administration. And linked up with that is this idea of dissent, that people are cast into the frontier because they've dissented against perhaps something small scale, like a policy, or an entire vision of what the court or the state should be. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, I mean, there have been snippets of this in your presentation. Your father had an idea of what should be taking place, and that this didn't always cleave as closely to the political reality as he would have hoped. And I wonder if we could tease out, or you could comment more on what your father thought the state should be ultimately, or what this idea of empire should be, if we want to use that term. And second, if there was an evolution to that. Mm-hmm. I know my own father, when he thinks of the state, changes his mind quite a bit. So I'm interested to see if there was a similar trajectory. Thank you.
Thanks. So I would say that first on the idea of exile being tied to dissent, of course that has happened throughout histories in many countries. For my father specifically, his being sent out into what was clearly exile in Xinjiang was not tied to any form of political dissent. It was tied to their perceptions of his loyalty based on his family background.
That class background.
Yeah, and so I think that was very common back in the 1950s, and of course there were many campaigns starting from 1950 onward in which they were seeking out and marking down potential subversives, and my father was a victim, as he discovered later, of one of those. And so, but in his, on your second question about the conception of the state, he did have different conceptions of it or what its goal should be. One of them, of course, was to reclaim the lands that had fallen away from central rule, what he perceives as central rule, and that included the western areas of Xinjiang and Tibet. So he was even though he disliked being sent out into exile and was suspicious of the reasons for that, he still embraced that mission as what he believed to be an important one for the party. He also believed in the economic rejuvenation of China. He believed that the state should be able to rebuild a republic from a very low level, the low level that China had reached in the context of the Japanese War and the Chinese Civil War, and that the party and Mao should and could industrialize China and put it on par with America and Britain. When I read the letters that he wrote to Sam, that's something that he emphasizes very much. And when he left Xinjiang to go to Xi'an to study at the Aeronautics University, he wrote a letter to Sam in early 1958 in which he beseeches Sam to come back and work to help build up China economically. And he says, and he lays out several examples of the way that China is advancing economically, industrially, including, for example, the opening of a new bridge across the Yangtze that connects to different parts of what we now know as Wuhan. So he would bring up these different examples, and they were all tied to the economic growth of China. So I think that that's another important aspect of it for him. And then dating back to 1950, the entire reason why I joined the military, obviously defense of a homeland against what was termed imperialist aggressors. So again, we have this use of the term empire, but in the way that the party traditionally uses it as a counterpoint to what China is. And Mao was saying, here's an empire America that intends to displace the party as the rule of China, and your job is to help defend China. And he fully embraced that. He believed that the state should be able to defend the homeland against other powers, which I think is a very common notion of what constitutes a modern nation state. So that's another idea in which he viewed the mission of the state.
And he had been a boy during the Japanese invasion and occupation.
And
so
had
that
very
must
much
have-
experienced that,
yeah.
Aaron, just one, for example, I was just thinking when you were mentioning dissent, one of the first names that popped into my mind was like Ho Wei Fang, who is this lawyer from interior China.
Sent to Shihe.
Yeah, sent to Shihe, sent to a Binguan, like the sort of preeminent example of a Binguan into exile in Xinjiang, because he has had this history of dissent against party policies, and then he's out there for a while, and then he made his way back into interior China.
Do we have time, Dinda, for one more question?
I would love it if we could. Yeah, let's
Just
do it.
right behind you there, I see one hand.
I've also got one, but
Oh,
yeah.
sorry.
Thank you, sir, for your great speech. I have a similar experience with your father. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm a junior student studying UMass Amherst, I study political science. I have a similar experience with you and your father, which essentially I wonder if my parents are able to attend my college graduation next year, which there are restrictions. My question is, I've been to Xinjiang 2 years ago. I see the prosperity and development it has accomplished. And although there are still human rights critiques, to what extent do you believe the human rights problem still exists, and what extent does the U.S. are using this to achieve the foreign policy goal and to somehow solitary China in the international stage? Thank you.
I mean, I haven't been out to the region since the end of 2016. It was, in fact, the very last reporting trip I made before I left my permanent post in China. But, you know, many of my colleagues have been out to the region, even though it's very difficult to report there. And I believe in the reports they have documented some of the human rights abuses that still take place out there, including campaigns of, for example, forced sterilization of Uyghurs and some other ethnic groups out there. So I do think that that still takes place. There's been some changes, for example, the internment camp system. There have been releases of some people who were kept in these centers. But at the same time, in recent years, there was also a big surge of the number of people, especially from the Uyghur ethnic group, who were put on trial and then placed into the prison system. So not in the internment center system, but in the official prison system. Even in Washington, I interviewed some Uyghurs who had family members who were put into that prison system for things like one woman, Rayhan Assad. She might be here today, but she is a Uyghur graduate of Harvard Law School, and her brother had come to the U.S. in 2016 on a State Department-sponsored trip where they invite talented people from China to tour the U.S. And then weeks after he got back to Xinjiang, he was arrested and then put on trial for inciting subversion and eventually sentenced to 15 years. So examples like that make me think that, you know, the human rights abuses are still very much present, though they do take different forms at different times. In terms of your question about U.S. policy, I think that, you know, U.S. government is a vast system. I speak to a lot of officials in it. I think different people in the system have different reasons for why they want to highlight certain human rights abuses in China. Some officials do want to do it for the reason that you state, I think that you're implying, which is that China is in the U.S. Views China generally as in this geopolitical competition with the U.S., and that some officials believe that by highlighting the human rights abuses, whether it's in Xinjiang or elsewhere, that it will decrease, for example, the international standing of China, perhaps elevate that of the United States, and also try and make China fit into some of the institutional norms that the U.S. generally tries to dominate. But you know, there are also officials who genuinely care about human rights abuses and want to highlight them either publicly or bring China into some form of judgment among international institutions because they think that that will help out the victims of those abuses. So I think the reason varies widely among different administration officials.
Thanks for bringing this question up, though. We are after time. We are beyond time, so we'll have to draw this to a close. But I want to again express our thanks at the university and at the Fairbanks Center. I think as a former director, maybe I still get to do that. Ed, for coming and sharing your thoughts with us and answering our questions so patiently. It's been super interesting. Again, everybody, At the Edge of Empire. We're not allowed to sell the book, but there's a bookstore not far away in Harvard Square.
Yeah.
Or Amazon is at your fingertips. Ed, thanks again
Thanks a lot,
so
Mark.
much.